Thank you. Good morning, everyone. First of all, big thank you to Engdi and the team at the MPA and Informa for bringing us together. I'm delighted to be back here 12 months after our first Accelerating Decarbonisation panel at this week. And my only suggestion before we kick off is maybe we should consider a bigger ballroom next time. I don't think we've had such a packed house all week. So please do take care when you're going in and out of the room because it's standing room only at the moment. So we've got a fantastic panel today. Fantastic, first of all, to see the diversity and the expertise that we've got on the stage. Public, private, port, R&D centres, and even more interested to see the blend between aviation sector, ICAO, and maritime. So as we've heard already, clearly in just over 2 months at MEPC 80, the revised IMO strategy for reduction of greenhouse gas emissions to shipping is expected to be adopted. There's so much to consider ahead of the July gathering, as the outcome of this meeting will clearly reshape the prospects for our industry. So at this morning's gathering, very timely, key questions we want to consider today is how can member states and industry play an active role in encouraging a strong and inclusive revision of the initial strategy? What are some of the challenges and opportunities faced in building and scaling up green shipping corridors? Clearly it's only 18 months, but the time has flown by since the Clydebank Declaration at COP26 in Glasgow. And how can green and digital shipping corridors complement the ongoing efforts by the IMO and industry to accelerate decarbonisation? As we all know, KETAC brings together 175 member states. I heard this morning, I learned from Ambassador Acker, the ICAO brings together even more member states. And of course, the IMO is only effective as its members' input and discussions. And it's great to see so many ambassadors joining the discussion today. We need agreement on targets which are challenging, but we also cannot take safety for granted. We all know that unfortunately all of our future fuel options are less safe than today's fuel. But we also need technically viable solutions and commercially feasible solutions. Whether they be net zero or absolute zero, there's clearly a need for common focus, and we also need clarity on timings. So I am expecting a huge amount of questions on Pigeonhole, which I'll try and remember how to use. Please don't wait until we get towards the end of the discussion. Please do submit your questions on Pigeonhole. We've only got 35 minutes for this session, so I'm not going to spend any more time with the introductions. I think everybody has been introduced before, and I'm going to move us straight into the discussion. So firstly, if I could come to you, Benedict, as our host. What's at risk, Benedict, if member states at IMO do not manage to align the new ambition to the Paris 1.5 degree trajectory? And as a member state, perhaps you can share who is Singapore collaborating with, discussing with, to try and reach a successful outcome in a few months' time.
Well, thank you so much, Nick, for those questions. So I think before I begin, firstly, I'd like to thank the Maritime and Port Authority for inviting us for this session and for allowing us to share our perspective as we move and develop our national and international strategies. So to your first question, maybe I can start by talking a little about the importance of the 1.5 degree goal itself. And I thought one initial starting point which we can make reference to is the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. It's a global deal on climate change. It's significant. It was agreed in 2015. And if you look at the Paris Agreement as it was concluded in 2015, it states that we need to work to get temperature increases to well below 2 degrees. And if possible, strive towards 1.5 degrees. That's more or less the wording in the agreement. But the focus of the agreement at that point in time was on the 2 degrees rather than the 1.5 degrees. 1.5 degrees was seen as an aspirational goal. And I think one of the key things that changed was in 2018. So 3 years after the Paris Agreement was concluded, you've got this thing called the IPCC 1.5 degree special report. And essentially what the IPCC 1.5 degree special report states is that if you look at the two goals, 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, actually there is a major difference. If you want to avoid tipping points, if you want to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, you should really be working towards 1.5 degrees and not 2 degrees. And if you translate that, what's the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees? One key reference point is when the world collectively needs to get to net zero. Under a 2-degree world, the world can collectively get to net zero in 2070. Under 1.5 degree, you need to get to net zero by 2050. So it's a 20-year time difference, which is major. It's very significant, especially if you're thinking of fully decarbonizing all our key major emitting sectors itself. And this shift in goal from 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees was solidified in the Glasgow climate talks. That was the last one of the key major milestones. In the Glasgow decisions, it was stated that actually the world collectively needs to get to net zero by or around 2050. And that was one of the key impetus which led us to rethink what we actually needed to do to enhance our climate ambitions. And last year, I think as Mr. Teo mentioned earlier, Singapore enhanced our ambition to get to net zero by 2050. So I thought that background is important in terms of where we need to go. Now to your next question in terms of what are the implications if IMO, the International Maritime Community, doesn't get isn't on that trajectory, isn't on that pathway. There are many, but I'd say 3 actually stand out to me. First is that if the world collectively needs to get to net zero and the international maritime community is not on that pathway, then what it essentially means is that somebody else has to take up the slack if we want to keep temperature increases below 1.5 degrees. And I think that will be very challenging. It would endanger global efforts amongst all the various sectors, all the various countries in order to be on that trajectory, on that pathway. I think which, as you have seen earlier, we are still not there yet. There's still a gap. There's still an emission gap that needs to be addressed. So that's first. The second thing is that given that the international maritime community is an important supply chain vector in terms of shipping, in terms of moving low carbon solutions around the world, you can think about your solar panels, your electric vehicles, even energy carriers like hydrogen, as well as the carriers like ammonia. If you don't get that in place in terms of getting to net zero, I think it'll be a lot more challenging for countries and companies to reach their net zero goal. And the last implication in terms of what if we don't get there is, I think the risk that we move away from a multilateral approach towards a more patchwork approach in terms of reaching goals. And our position in Singapore as a small open country state is that we think a multilateral approach whereby we all work together gives us the best chance of achieving those goals in a most efficient way itself. And I reflect a little on the work that I've done in ICAO. So one of the key pieces of work that I did in ICAO was to lead the group that actually wrote together and draft together what we call CORSIA, the CORSIA eligibility rule. So it's a carbon offsetting and reduction scheme for international aviation. And at that point in time, 2013, there was a lot of debate as to whether we need a market-based mechanism for international aviation or not. The EU was talking about extending the EU ETS to international aviation. And I think that clearly exemplifies the point that I'm trying to make, that this approach whereby each country, each group takes its own subnational approach towards emissions reduction is suboptimal compared to international bodies, UN bodies like IMO coming together and agreeing on a multilateral approach itself. So I think that's critical and that's very important. To your next question in terms of who are some of the, in a sense, partners that we have in preparation for MEPC 80, I'd first say we see MEPC 80 as a critical milestone in terms of revising the strategy. And we see the strategy comprising of 2 very important parts: a raised ambition raise goal, as well as some of the measures that are needed to reach those goals, as well as the interim targets and goals itself. Because while it is important to state that we need to get to net zero by a certain year, I think what's more critical is to ensure that we are on a credible pathway towards that. And that's where setting near and medium-term goals as we work towards 2050 is absolutely important. There are no specific countries that we are working with because we see ourselves as a bridge builder in all the various forums that we worked in, IMO, ICAO, the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And that means taking an inclusive approach, working with all the players around the table to work towards a credible outcome, a viable solution, goal that everybody is comfortable with. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Benedict. And if I could now perhaps turn to Alicia and Saskia. It might not be immediately obvious to everybody who's not met you before when you look at the job titles, but you're responsible for building and coordinating the green corridors between the US and Port of Rotterdam. Of course, like Singapore, multiple corridors being discussed, multiple destinations, two of the biggest and important destinations for maritime. So what are your biggest challenges today that you face in establishing those green corridors? Is it fuel choice, lack of technology, closing the gap on fuel affordability, lack of regulation? I guess it's a concoction or an ingredient of those, but perhaps you can start, Alicia.
Thank you, Nick, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. So maybe just a couple words on what we do in Green Shipping Corridors and what our role is. So C40 is an international climate nonprofit working through cities to deliver urgent climate action. Our role in Green Shipping Corridors is a convener, a facilitator. We're somebody with a holistic climate action perspective who brings together public and private sector players and helps them move from action to from ambition to action to implementation. We are currently involved in 2 green corridor initiatives. We are supporting the Singapore, Los Angeles, Long Beach Green and Digital Shipping Corridor, which was referenced in Mr. Teo's opening remarks. And this corridor partnership signed an MOU earlier this week and will be moving into action planning shortly. We are also supporting the Los Angeles-Shanghai Green Shipping Corridor, which is one of the busiest container routes in the world, responsible for moving over 40% of all goods arriving into the United States. The corridor partnership for Los Angeles-Shanghai has been working on defining the goals and the actions on the corridor and is preparing to release an implementation plan. So back to the question about the challenges. So by nature, green shipping corridor partnerships are complex and challenging because they require a collaborative approach from stakeholders who may not typically collaborate. In many cases, would compete. And here they need to come together and commit to shared goals and joint actions, and that is challenging. Green corridor partnerships require radical innovation in how we think about goals, actions, and what successful outcomes may look like. Incremental innovation is also important because it allows us to demonstrate progress using technologies we have available to us today. But the real challenge is for the corridor partnerships to demonstrate how they can catalyze transition to green fuels. And that calls for new business models, new success metrics, a new way of thinking about how we commit to things together. So then, building on that, I think I would highlight 3 main challenges that green corridors face today. One is cross-value chain collaboration. Second one would be governance. And third one would be regulation. And there are certainly many others, but I think these are very fundamental. I think for many of us who are involved in green shipping corridor partnerships, understand that cross-value chain collaboration is a fundamental building block. It's kind of a key ingredient in a recipe for a green shipping corridor. We can't do without it. But it is something that has been challenging. Many corridor partnerships have been shipping-centric, and we feel more needs to be done to engage with other actors from the value chain. More needs to be done to engage with cargo owners. We have had very successful engagement with the cargo owners on the LA-Shanghai corridor, for example, and they've been a driving force behind the progress on that particular corridor. But there needs to be more engagement with the cargo owners. There needs to be more engagement with the fuel producers to help overcome the obstacles of cost and scalability. In the same way, we feel more needs to be done to engage with cities, which is our domain. Cities need to be engaged in green corridor partnerships because of their symbiotic relationships with ports. But it's not just the political support and climate ambition that they bring to the table. Cities can help unlock finance and investment. They can provide training for green jobs. They can stimulate innovation, create and enable new ecosystems for zero-emission technologies. But most importantly, cities can push for action at the local level, which we think is critical to enable global impact. So on my second point, related to governance, that is another big challenge that we think is something that we all need to solve together. Many corridors will feature competitors, and things like sharing information, establishing effective decision-making mechanisms has been challenging. In order to address this challenge, we feel there is a need to develop some kind of framework that allows us to make decisions, that allows us to identify and define roles of partners and stakeholders within a corridor. And while we're all learning how to do green corridors, there are lessons that could be learned from other sectors where public-private partnerships have been successful at unlocking collaboration through new ways of working together. Offshore wind, for example, is a good sector to learn lessons from, because it brought together energy companies, ports, shipbuilding industry, public and private sector finance, and governments. And all together, they created this entirely new energy and supply chain ecosystem, which has been extremely successful and scalable. So we need to do something similar in the green shipping space. And these are the lessons that could be learned from other sectors. And then the third thing is regulation, and I think Ben Chi already brought up some really, really key issues around regulation. We are working with first movers who are very ambitious, and we're very lucky to have them as our partners, and we're very lucky to be able to support them in moving these corridors forward. But in order for this change to be systemic, we need regulation. And so things like putting price on shipping emissions is going to be critical in order to help green shipping corridors move forward.
Thank you very much. Saskia?
It does? Okay. Oh, now it does. Morning, everyone. I think for us, one of the key challenges is how do we make use of what is out there already? Because a green corridor tries to solve, basically accelerate the issues we see as an industry. And I'm willing to bet that in some way or form, every one of you is currently involved in somehow thinking and working towards decarbonization. So how do we bring that together? And I think the challenge is actually quite a simple one. I mean, there's a reason why one of the SDGs is actually collaboration, because we need to work differently, like Alisa said before too. And I think what we find is, how do you have a group that's small enough so you can make steps, right? You can move from that ambition into action. And so yesterday we had the second face-to-face workshop for the Rotterdam-Singapore corridor. We had, I think, we increased exponentially in the amount of people attending that workshop. And what we did there is we put people in the different fuel choices, different fuel packages. So they identified all the questions that Nick asked before around what are the gaps technically, commercially, all these different things. And what we see is we need to pull in people who have key knowledge. So what we're trying to do as much as we possibly can is work with partners like the Methanol Institute, or my colleague on the right, Maersk McKinney Møller Institute, GMF was there. We worked with Oxford Institute, Oxford University, who already did some work on contracts for difference. So there are many different things that we're trying to pull together. Now, at the same time, many people approach us almost on a daily basis of wanting to be part of this corridor. And again, we need it to be practical enough for work to be done, and at the same time we want to communicate as quickly as possible to the rest of the world and share our findings, because this is not about two ports trying to create a competitive advantage, right? This is trying to solve for something that we need to distribute as quickly as we possibly can. And then I think a specific word on the finance or the premium gap you said we need to close. I'm very excited that there we pulled in a number of people from the finance and regulatory space to start brainstorming. And one of the things we said there is, and I think this is the difficult piece from a personal, right, from a deeply personal point of view. We see that we need to pool our ignorance. Because we're all experts in a certain part, but in order to solve this puzzle, it's so complex and it's so big. So how do you best do that? Now, what we did in that finance and regulatory space, we basically looked at two key pieces. One is we're working with COSEF, with the Zero Emission Buyer Alliance, who have got quite an exciting model of basically tendering for volume and sending a very clear signal from the cargo owners to the liners that yes, there is a need for fuel, they're willing to buy a premium, and they're asking for that, they're wanting to give that signal now for fuel to be delivered in the future. So I think that's very exciting. And then the second thing we want to do in that space is we want to frame what our ask to the regulator is. Because yes, we need regulatory support, Elisa said it too. But what is it exactly? And I think that's what's exciting about the corridor work, is that we can do that on behalf of all those partners.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn to Pernille now. Clearly we're seeing progress, momentum building, but we know that we're likely to be following an S-curve in terms of transition, and we need to see large-scale, zero-emission deep-sea vessels entering service this decade. We have a number of organizations clearly calling for an ambition of at least 5% of the fuel we use to be zero-emission fuels before 2030. So what tangible steps and activities can we expect in terms of public-private partnerships towards that, please, Pernille?
Thank you very much for being here. Good morning, everyone. There's been a lot of talk about collaboration. I can only agree to that. An enormous amount of collaboration is needed. On that particular question, you would say from our center's perspective, our analysis shows us that one area of concern is that there's a demand coming up. There are vessels now being delivered that are dual fuel. If we look at the supply side, there's not an awful lot of supply. So unless we accelerate dramatically the construction of plants that can produce all the methanol, we may end up with having companies who can proudly show that 25% of their fleet is, say, methanol enabled, but it sails on heavy fuel because the methanol is not available. So I think that's really an area where we need an awful lot of collaboration, public-private, we need regulation, we need redirection. The money is there. The oil and gas industry has plenty of money. If they redirect that money into production of renewables, we don't have a problem. But we need something to drive that, and we need that sooner rather than later. Because exactly as you say, the curve, if we are to stick to the 1.5 degree, which is our clear ambition, our clear strategy, we need a very steep decline in the coming 5-7 years. So I'm very thrilled that Mr. Kiekert has announced this fund that the IMO will hopefully agree on in July. I hope that can also support that whole development of the supply side in a way that at the same time supports the Global South.
Thank you. Ambassador Acker. So you were telling me earlier this morning of the progress ICAO has made. I think many times we, as a maritime industry, tend to talk to ourselves, not necessarily to other industries, and learn what other modes of transportation are progressing with. I think there's a known risk, but also a known opportunity that we're looking for similar fuels between the different modes of transportation. So perhaps you could share with us the progress of ICAO in setting long-term targets, what fuels aviation may be turning its focus towards, and perhaps what you hope in terms of seeing collaboration between maritime and aviation going forward.
Thank you. Good morning to everybody. But just before answering your question, Nick, let me clarify that on this podium, I am just elaborating on the related matters as the official representative of my country rather than representing ICAO Secretariat. Okay. As the standard-setting institution of the aviation sector, ICAO attaches utmost importance to decarbonize the aviation sector to combat the climate change. Being well aware of the destructive effects of CO2 emissions on the climate, ICAO adopted a carbon offsetting and reduction scheme for international aviation, shortly abbreviated to CORSIA, in 2016, which is the first global market-based measure for any sector to reduce emissions emanating from international aviation. CORSIA complements the other elements of the basket of measures by offsetting the amount of CO2 emissions that cannot be reduced through the use of technologies or innovations, operational improvements, or sustainable aviation fuel. It is already under implementation, voluntarily basis, by 2027, when it's going to be mandatory. But it is worth to note that already 115 member states are voluntarily implementing ICAO out of 193 member states. Since June 2018, ICAO, as the part of No Country Left Behind initiative of ICAO, has been supporting its member states in implementing the CORSIA in a coordinated approach under the assistance, technical cooperation, and training for CORSIA program. However, ICAO has recently added another historic agreement to deal with the climate impact of aviation. It adopted long-term aspirational goal, LTAC shortly, in October 22 in last General Assembly, which advocates net zero carbon emissions by 2050 in support of the UNFCCC Paris Agreement's temperature goal. It is important to note that LTAC doesn't attribute specific obligations or commitments in the form of emissions reductions goals to individual member states. It recognizes each state's circumstances and respective capabilities like level of development, maturity of aviation market, sustainable growth of its international market, just transition and national priorities of air transportation, development of this member state. So each member state will contribute to LTAC within its own national time frame. Coming back to your question regarding the fuels, ICAO has conducted a feasibility study in respect with the oils, which led to the agreement to LTAC. This technical analysis focused on the implementation of various in-sector mitigation measures, such as aircraft technology, operational improvements, and sustainable aviation fuels. For the fuels, this analysis covered the potential CO2 emissions reductions coming from the several fuel categories, including drop-in fuels, such as biomass-based fuel or solid liquid waste based fuels, lower carbon petroleum fuels, and non-drop-in fuels like hydrogen and liquefied gas aviation fuels. So it would be wise to say that ICAO is not limiting its efforts on a specific fuel type or combine, because of the achievement of the LTAC, it will rely on the combined effect of the multiple CO2 emissions reduction measures, including the accelerated adoption of new and innovative aircraft technologies, streamlined airline operations, and the increased production and deployment of sustainable aviation fuel. It is estimated that sustainable aviation fuels will play most critical role to mitigate the CO2 emissions from aviation sector, keeping in mind that ICAO focuses on how to diversify the resources and increase the supply of alternative aviation fuels. Regarding the cooperation, a strong partnership between ICAO and IMO, or aviation and maritime sectors, will enhance certainly the safe transport passengers and goods, and it will contribute to the global efforts to reduce GHG emissions, especially the challenges related to integration of new technologies, innovations like autonomous systems, and artificial intelligence represents the opportunity for cooperation and collaboration and revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development in line with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you.
Thank you. So very encouraging to see that ICAO has managed to set its 2050 net zero target. Time's passing fast, and I can see we only have 3 minutes on our big clock here before the end of the panel. So I'm going to turn to the pigeonhole questions, which you can vote for. So give me a help with prioritizing them. The first one with a clear winner is active. Does that work? Hopefully. How can we ensure that the greenhouse gases will be effectively implemented after adoption? Has IMO in place an enforcement, verification, or audit mechanism? So perhaps Benedict, would you like to share your view? We have to keep the answers quite short.
Yeah, thanks so much. So I'll share my view not from the IMO perspective, but more from the UNFCCC perspective. So under the UNFCCC, there is, I think as mentioned, there is, the goals are nationally determined, so the countries decide what they're able to do. But underpinning that is a requirement for them to come back and to explain once every 2 years and to be subject to a review where their current emissions are right now, what they're doing to reduce their emissions, and to break down all the various key measures that they have and whether they are on track to meeting their emissions targets, and thereafter be subject to a review. And this happens once every 2 years. The other thing that was agreed in Glasgow, which I think is quite significant, is to shorten the windows for setting targets. So in the past, countries have flexibility in terms of the time frames, and many of them took a 10-year time frame. But the concern was that 10 years was too long. And now under this new time frame agreement, actually now we have to come out after 2030, each country's goals are in 5-year blocks, which then exposes the country to much greater scrutiny. And in the middle of the 5-year pledging cycle, there is what's called a global stocktake, to see whether we are on track to meeting all our various climate goals itself. The other feature I think which is quite important to highlight under the UNFCCC is that there is an expectation to continually revise and update each country's nationally determined contribution. And when you update it, you need to demonstrate an improvement in ambition itself. So while it's nationally determined, I think there are two broad elements to ensure that we remain on track. One is the continual updating process. The other is the very tight, the very enhanced transparency framework, which shines a spotlight at what countries are doing. Thanks.
Thank you, Benedict. I'm going to try and squeeze in, hopefully, a short answer to this next question. I think we've got a view on this. Around green corridors. Do green corridors undermine a multilateral approach? Saskia?
Yeah, no, I don't think they do. I think they serve as a way to demonstrate how things could be done, which could then be quickly copied. So an example, I was very happy to see that Singapore and LA, Long Beach, also signed an MOU, because I think the challenges we face are so big that will help. I think where it will be what will be helpful in the shorter term is that we can use sort of great government relations like the one between Singapore and Rotterdam to see can we stimulate and can we bridge until we see economies of scale of renewable fuels, certain incentives.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to hand back to the MC, and perhaps you can just join me in thanking the panel.